Good evening. You're very welcome to this evening's event. My name is Simon O'Connor. I'm the director here at the Museum of Literature Ireland, and we're delighted to be hosting this wonderful discussion as part of events to coincide with the 175th anniversary of the visit of Frederick Douglass to Ireland in 1845. I'd like to extend our thanks to Dennis Brownlee of the African American Irish Diaspora Network, to Ciarán Madden, Ragnar Almquist, and all of our consular staff in Washington and New York who so generously supported this exhibition and the events surrounding it. And of course to Nettie Washington Douglass and Professor Christine Kinealy, who'll be joining Dennis in conversation this evening. We wanted to give you a brief glimpse of our own Frederick Douglass exhibition here at the museum, which has, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, had a slightly shorter public life than we would have liked, but we are delighted to announce it will be moving to the wonderful Nano Nagle Place in Cork this spring. The exhibition is the first instalment in our new Literature and Ideas series and forms a gentle introduction to who Frederick Douglass was and the importance of both his writing and his visit to Ireland. The exhibition has been standing in the beautiful Old Physics Theatre here at MoLI, a room which was also the scene of a famous chapter in James Joyce's Portrait of the Artist as a young man, so there's certainly a touch of the revolutionary atmosphere to the space. The exhibit explores Frederick's early life as a slave, as well as taking a look at his famous narrative, both on its own terms and in the context of similar works of the time, such as 12 Years a Slave by Solomon Northup and Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl by Hattie Jacobs. His own accounts make for harrowing reading, as one would expect, but the writing played a key role in the abolitionist movement in the US. Douglass escaped slavery at the age of 20 and travelled across the Atlantic, arriving eventually in Dublin in August 1845, and he spent 4 months touring the country here. He himself said, "I can truly say I have spent some of the happiest moments of my life since landing in this country." During his time here, Frederick also met Daniel O'Connell, the liberator, and was greatly influenced by him. As he remarked at the time in one of his own lectures, the poor trampled slave of Carolina had heard the name of the liberator with joy and hope. Of course, the legacy of Douglass's work remains tangible and essential today, and to that end, we're delighted to be able to bring together this evening his great-great-granddaughter Nettie alongside friends who have championed his legacy in the US. On that note, I'll pass you over to one of those friends, the Consul General of Ireland in New York, Ciarán Madden.
To join for this event, bringing together some really wonderful partners. The Museum of Literature Ireland, which in its short life so far has already become a star in Ireland's cultural landscape, the historian Christine Kinealy, and the founding chairperson of the African American Irish Diaspora Network, Dennis Brownlee. But I want to offer a special welcome, even virtually to Ireland from New York, to Nettie Washington Douglass. She is, as Simon said, great-great-granddaughter of Frederick Douglass, but she is also descended from Booker T. Washington. By any measure of United States history, that's some lineage. And that is before you even touch on her own achievements, including combating human trafficking now across the world. I had the honor of meeting Nettie's son when he came here to the consulate about 2 years ago to collect a stunning sculpture of Frederick Douglass that belonged to another great American hero, John Lewis. So that's a whole other story which we won't get into today. The story of Frederick Douglass in Ireland is an important point of intersection between Irish and African American history and Irish and American history more broadly. In the context of the Museum of Literature Ireland, I should mention, of course, that this visit was captured and fictionalized by Colin McCann in his book Transatlantic. And there are other intersections of African American Irish history in that period also, many of them captured by Christine Kinealy in a book she published last year on Black abolitionists in Ireland. I was honored 11 months ago to host the launch of the African American Irish Diaspora Network. Just before lockdown, the network, led by Dennis Brownlee, has done exceptionally well over those 11 months, not just to maintain the momentum of the launch, but build on it with new events, despite the challenges that lockdown presents. Dennis can speak more in detail about the work of the network. But in brief, it was established to bring together African Americans of Irish heritage and deepen their links with Ireland. It's estimated that up to 1/3 of African Americans have some Irish heritage. We don't have hard data, but that seems to be the broad window. Whatever the precise number, it is a huge number. And that heritage comes from a variety of places. Much of it comes from normal family interactions over the last 2 centuries, except that we know that some of those families, maybe many of those families, had to endure prejudice over those decades. However, there's no doubt also that some of that heritage comes from the darker parts of our shared history, slavery and coercion. So as we explore the shared history of African Americans and other Irish Americans, we must ensure that we take the bad with the good, so that it is honest and it is comprehensive. And only in that way can we build a foundation for the future. Our goal is to ensure that all Irish Americans feel welcome in Ireland and feel welcome in Irish America, regardless of skin color or anything else. If they want to connect with their Irishness, we want to make sure it is there for them. It is inclusive and welcoming. And that message of inclusivity goes to the heart of the new Diaspora strategy launched by the Minister for the Diaspora, Colin Brophy, in the middle of November. This message is working. With the launch of the network and some of the events they have hosted, and some of events hosted by others, I'd like to make mention here of Glucksman Ireland House at New York University also. I feel like a flare has been sent up. People are coming forward to connect with their Irishness who haven't done so before, and to connect with Ireland. Some of those are people who are discovering their heritage for the first time. Others are people who are aware of their heritage, but may not always have felt welcome in Irish America or thought they would not be welcome. I hope they do so now. It's a hugely important message to send. This will be the work of years, maybe decades, but it is important work. It's also important in the context of a changing Ireland. Ireland is a far different place from the homogenous place in which I grew up 30 years ago. And we're all the better for it. And in that, we must recognize that our diaspora is also diverse. This brings us back to Frederick Douglass. We rightly take pride in many of the words he used about his visit to Ireland. For example, and I pilfered Christine Kinealy's own works here on Frederick Douglass. He wrote, I am covered with the soft grey fog of the Emerald Isle. I breathe, and lo, the chattel becomes a man. And there are many other such quotes. But I think it is important that rather than take these and other words as a historic pat on the back, we must see them as a challenge. They're words we must try to live up to now in the 21st century. And that marks all the more the importance of the 175th anniversary of the visit. It is also the case that his views of the Irish in America were quite different. I'm quoting again from him. Perhaps no class of our fellow citizens has carried this prejudice against colour to a point more extreme and dangerous than have our Catholic Irish fellow citizens. I'm not trying to paint one lot completely in the right, one lot completely in the wrong, but to underline complexity. There was good and bad. In Ireland, we love our history. We particularly love to remember anyone who slighted us at any point in our history. But the value of that history is when we use it as a guide to our better future. The final quote I would take from Frederick Douglass speaks, the life of a nation is secure only while the nation is honest, truthful, and virtuous. We must be honest in our assessment of the history and take our leadership from the Frederick Douglass as we look forward. We honour his legacy, and we honour him by extending awareness and understanding of that legacy. But we also honour him by acting to further his goals. And that is why we are honoured to support the African American Irish Diaspora Network and this exhibition. Thank you. I think I missed my cue. I was also supposed to hand over to Dennis Brownlee, the founding chairperson of the African American Irish Diaspora Network. Thank you.
Thank you, Ciarán, for that introduction. Good afternoon to everyone, and good evening. It was almost a year ago, as Ciarán said, on February 26, 2020, that the formal launch of the African American Irish Diaspora Network took place, an event that Consul General Madden so generously hosted at his residence in New York. And we're just extremely grateful for all the support that you've provided us, Ciarán, in our mission to connect African Americans with Ireland, particularly during this year in which we have celebrated the 175th anniversary of Frederick Douglass's historic visit to Ireland in 1845. I won't go into a lot more detail about the African American Irish Diaspora Network now. I would invite everyone to visit our website at aaidnet.org to get more information and to follow us on Facebook. I'd also like to thank Simon O'Connor and the Museum of Literature Ireland for partnering with us to stage this Frederick Douglass exhibition. We first started talking about it shortly before the pandemic hit, and through the many challenges posed by the COVID restrictions, Simon persisted to get the exhibition staged, and it was finally able to open for a few weeks in December. We look forward to it reopening and for it to travel to various locations throughout Ireland and ultimately to several different locations in the US. I'm excited to be joined today by Nettie Washington Douglass and Professor Christine Kinealy, whom we are so honored to have both as board members of AAIDN. Nettie Washington Douglass has a unique distinction of coming from two great bloodlines of Americans, Frederick Douglass and Booker T. Washington. She is the founder and president of the Frederick Douglass Family Initiatives. She's a past volunteer for the United Negro College Fund and has many achievements in education and public service. And Professor Christine Kinealy received her PhD at Trinity College in Dublin. She is a professor of Irish history at Quinnipiac University and is a director of the Great Hunger Institute at Quinnipiac. She's published many books, including Frederick Douglass in Ireland in His Own Words and Black Abolitionists in Ireland, which she released this year. Just a little bit earlier. And she has published she's transcribed all of Frederick Douglass's 50 lectures that he gave when he took his tour in Ireland in 1845. It's a real pleasure for me to be able to host this discussion with Christine and with Nettie today. And Christine, let me start with you. First, let me thank you for helping us all get to know Frederick Douglass better through your comprehensive research and scholarship. And let me ask you, what makes Frederick Douglass such an important historical figure here?
There are many reasons. If I can go back to something Ciarán said about inclusivity, and when I think of Frederick Douglass, I think of inclusivity. He's somebody who, despite being subject to so much prejudice himself throughout his life, he never showed that prejudice to other people. He was consummate in terms of forgiving people. We know as an older man, he visited his master, and the master was dying at this stage. The two men held hands and they cried. And Frederick wrote very movingly about it. So that inclusivity, that spirit of compassion, of forgiveness, and this is what he brought to the political stage. In the last few years, when we haven't seen so much civility in political discourse, he was always civil. And it is even more remarkable when set against his own life story. He was born into enslavement. He never knew what year, what day he was born on. He educated himself. He knew he could not remain enslaved. And so at the age of 20, at great risk to himself, he self-emancipated. He became an abolitionist. He stayed in America. He was always in danger of being recaptured and sent back into slavery, but he wanted to help other people. He wrote his narrative, and that eventually brought him to Ireland. And his life is just so inspirational because despite being born into enslavement, having no education, no formal education, he went on to inform, to advise 6 American presidents. He became, like Ciarán is, he became Consul General. This time it was very deliberate. He was fascinated by Haiti, the first Black republic in the world, and he became minister to Haiti. And the day he died, 1895, he was 77 years old. He went to a meeting for women's suffrage. So his political legacy is just incredible. And in his lifetime, his achievements were recognized. But I think particularly the last year or 2 years, his legacy just seems to be growing. More and more people seem to be aware of Frederick Douglass and looking to Frederick Douglass at moments of despair or when they need inspiration. So I would say his legacy is enormous, and it just seems that it's getting even bigger.
And Christine, why was his trip to Ireland in 1845 so meaningful, and why are we still celebrating it 175 years later?
Yeah. So he escaped from slavery, but as I said, he could at any stage have been recaptured and taken back to into enslavement. But he became an abolitionist. He started to lecture. Of course, he was very young, but he was the superstar of the abolitionist movement. But this put him, again, because of his fame, it put him in even greater danger of being recaptured. Some people came to doubt his story, so he wrote a narrative. And Simon said at the very beginning, it was not the first slave narrative, it was not the last slave narrative, but probably it was the most successful slave narrative ever. So this was published in Boston, 1845. Again, it just threw so much light on him. And so his friends at this point persuaded him for his own safety, he needed to leave America. And it was a great sacrifice. He was married, he had 4 young children. But in August 1845, he sailed across the Atlantic. He spent 2 days in Liverpool, and then he came to Dublin. That night he wrote to Garrison, he said he was safe in dear old Ireland. And from the very start, that was what was remarkable about his time in Ireland. For the first time in his life, he felt safe. And then within 2 weeks of being in Ireland, he wrote he was experiencing something he'd never experienced before. He felt he was equal. And again, Ciarán quoted that, the soft grey sky of Ireland and lo, the chattel becomes a man. So very, very powerful writing. But what brought him to Ireland initially was because a Dublin Quaker who was an abolitionist had offered to reprint the narrative so that Frederick could sell copies of his book and have some income when he was traveling, when he was in exile. So Frederick came to Dublin expecting to stay for 4 days to oversee the narrative being republished. He was made to feel so welcome that he stayed for 4 months. And during that time, as we know, he lectured extensively, 50 lectures. Sometimes he would lecture for up to 2 hours. He never wrote anything down, it's from memory. And I have transcribed his lectures, and each one is different and each one is brilliant, which is remarkable for a 27-year-old self-educated former slave. And for him, Ireland transformed him. He used the word that his time in Ireland was not only the happiest moments of his life, but it was transformative. And as you see him progress through Ireland, you see Frederick is really developing his own voice, his own agency. And when, after almost 2 years, he returns to America, he's very different. He's a Frederick who wants his independence. So in many ways, Ireland, his encounter with Daniel O'Connell, his encounter with Irish abolitionists, really put him on the pathway. And he talks about himself from transforming from being simply an abolitionist to being somebody who cares about oppression and human rights wherever oppression exists. So Ireland really is transformative to Frederick in that sense. And those lessons are really applicable today. So I think that's why 175 years later, the things that Frederick was fighting against, the methodology he used to fight against them, agitate, really resonates today.
Mm-hmm. And Nettie, I'm so pleased and honored to have the opportunity to work with you as a colleague and as a friend. As Frederick Douglass's great-great-granddaughter, tell us about your unique perspective on his legacy and his special affinity with Ireland, and how you viewed that as you were growing up.
Thank you. And I want to say hello to everyone. Good evening, Ireland. Thank you so much for having me a part of this program. I'm touched. I really am. I want to say up front, please excuse my voice, having a little sinus issue. I want to start out by saying something happened to me 30 years ago that kind of changed my perspective of having this unique ancestry. And it's something that I shared when and if I may, I would like to, no one can say anything about Frederick Douglass better than Frederick Douglass himself. I want to read this quote that he said about why being in Ireland was so very important to him. And as we know, and I'm going to read this, Frederick Douglass arrived in Ireland at the first signs of the potato plight. So Douglass's impression of the Irish was not so much influenced by the suffering that would come to define the casualties of famine in the months and years ahead. He was moved instead by a, quote, total absence of all manifestations of prejudice against me on account of my color. The change of circumstances in this is particularly striking. I find myself not treated as a color, but as a man, not as a thing, as a child of the common father of us all, end of quote. And what happened to me, I'll try to be brief with this, but as a child and an only child, I would get a little uncomfortable when I would be taken certain places for certain events because people would stare at me, they want to touch me, pinch my cheeks. And I'm sure my family tried to explain why, but it kind of always made me feel a little uncomfortable. So my first trip to Ireland was in 2011. I was a guest of Don Mullen, and I'm sure we'll get into that a little bit later. But Don invited me to go to an event with him. And I was standing there listening to the speakers, and all of a sudden I heard my name. I was being introduced, and I did not know I was going to speak. So as I'm walking up to the podium, it's like, oh my gosh, what am I going to say? What am I going to say? And then it just came to me after I said my little prayer that what had happened to me as a child and feeling so uncomfortable, I wanted to pass that forward. I had a conversation with a lady one day. I don't know how she found me, why she called me, except she had a message to give to me. And it was, Nettie, I so appreciate what your ancestors did for me. If it hadn't been for them, I would not be where I am today. I would love to be able to thank them, hug them, give them a kiss, but I can't because they're not here. But I feel if I say to you what I would want to say to him, you're my messenger to him. So remembering that conversation, I stood before this group and I basically said the following. I told the story, what I just explained, and I said, I want to, from the bottom of my heart, to thank each and every one of you in this room whose ancestors were in Ireland when my great-great-grandfather was there. Because of your ancestors, that my grandfather felt the way he did. And given the quote that I just said, you allowed him for the first time in his life to feel like a human being, a man. Walking down the street, he said that gentlemen would come up to him, extend their hands, look him in the eye, call him Mr. Douglass. He didn't get that in his own country. He had to go to Ireland to feel like a man for the first time in his life. So again, from the bottom of my heart, passing forward, I would love to be able to thank your ancestors. I can't, but I feel if I thank you, I'm thanking your ancestors. So now I'll wipe away the tears.
That's very nice. So you often say, Nettie, in conversation that you feel Frederick Douglass, that he's with you and you feel his spirit. Tell us about that. And, if you would relate the story about when you felt the wind when you were in Ireland.
I have been asked before. I was asked by a reporter one time, who do you feel closer to, Frederick Douglass or Booker T. Washington? Which I thought was kind of an odd question because I did not know either one of them. But I said Frederick Douglass right away. And then I thought later, why? Because Booker T is a generation closer. But I came up with the fact that I spent my summers from the time I was 2.5 with my grandmother Douglass. Unfortunately, my grandfather, Joseph Douglass, Frederick's grandson, died before I was born. but I spent every summer with my grandmother on the Chesapeake, on the western shore of the Chesapeake, opposite from where he was born a slave. And I spent my summers in his home. My grandmother talked about him all the time. She met him when she was a little girl here in Atlanta. And I think because I was around his things and the life as being an abandoned child is what I say, an abandoned child. Booker T had a family unit. He had a mother and a stepfather and siblings. Frederick Douglass had no one but himself from the time that he was 6 years old. So I think my motherly instinct gravitated toward the abandoned child. So one day I was in Maryland, and they were in his hometown, Eastern Maryland. They were going to dedicate, they called it a bridge. It was actually a road that went over the Tuckahoe River off in the woods where he was born. And as I was walking to the event, I said a little prayer, which I normally do, like before I started today, a little prayer to both of them. If you don't want me to embarrass you, please be with me. So I said to him as I was walking up to my seat, said a little prayer, and I talked to him, and I said, "This is big for you. This is the first time that you are being recognized in your hometown, and I need to know that you are here with me." The program started. Certain point came, and out of the clear, it was a perfectly calm. It was an overcast day, but perfectly calm. And out of nowhere came this slight breeze, and I came to realize every time I would say that little prayer and ask him to be with me, I would get this feeling head to toe after the wind. It's a certain wind. I can't explain which wind it is, but the wind comes, and when I know it's him responding to me, I get chills from head to toe. And so I didn't talk about it. I was afraid if I said something, it would go away. But I had a witness in Ireland, so I feel comfortable to share that now.
That's very powerful. That's very powerful. Christine, now Frederick delivered more than 50 lectures in Ireland during his time there. And he traveled from Dublin to Cork, Limerick, to Belfast. Tell us a little bit about his tour of Ireland and the different speeches that he made and the kind of crowds that he generated as he was touring through Ireland.
Yeah, so although Frederick didn't write down his speeches, the newspapers covered him, which again tells you he was a pretty remarkable young man. We don't know precisely his audience numbers, but from the venues we can guess. So he spoke at the now gone Music Hall in Dublin, and that could hold over 3,000 people. So probably to really large audiences. The very first place he spoke in Dublin was what's now City Hall on Dame Street. And there were so many people there, it was crowded, so he moved. He spoke in the meeting house in Eustace Street, so anybody who knows Dublin will know these places. And then the highlight of his Dublin trip was on the 29th of September. He went to hear his great hero, Daniel O'Connell, speak. And 3,000 people were there. Frederick was at the back. And when Daniel O'Connell sat down, the crowd emptied out, and Frederick moved to the front and met Daniel O'Connell's son, John. And John said, "Come and meet my father." And Daniel O'Connell actually called Frederick onto stage and asked Frederick to make a speech. So Frederick made this impromptu speech. We actually heard part of it, Ciarán read part of it, where he ends it by actually borrowing a phrase from Daniel O'Connell, which became his phrase: agitate, agitate, agitate. And that definitely was one of the highlights of his visit. In Dublin, he'd been hosted by some Quakers who are really at the forefront of the abolition movement, and they arranged for him from Dublin to go down and lecture in Wexford and Waterford in Youghal. Sadly, we have no record of his Youghal speech. We have all the other speeches. Then he went to Cork and spent almost a month in Cork, again lecturing to full audiences. We can see again how he's changing, because when he's leaving Cork, there is a party for him, and at the end of the party he sings. And Nettie and I know how musical Frederick was, but I get a sense of he just felt so comfortable at this stage that he exposed something that was very private, very dear to him. From Cork he went to Limerick, spent some time in Limerick, came back to Dublin, didn't lecture, and then he went to Belfast. And that was very different because Belfast was a town, an industrial town in the 1840s, and it was primarily Presbyterian. And in the rest of Ireland, he'd been able to talk very openly about his admiration for Daniel O'Connell. It seems most of his audiences were largely Catholic, largely supported the repeal movement. But the town of Belfast was very different. It didn't support Daniel O'Connell, and it didn't support Frederick's mentor, William Lloyd Garrison. So there were two anti-slavery movements in Ireland, essentially. And again, we see the skill of Frederick, that everywhere he went, he was able to engage with the audience, again, in a civil way, without offending them, yet always remaining true to his message. And he left Ireland, he left Belfast at the beginning of January. He went to Scotland. In Scotland, he was homesick. And when he left Belfast, he was presented with a Bible. And one of his legacies in Belfast was that a ladies' anti-slavery committee was formed. And one of the leading lights of that committee was a woman who was almost 80, Mary Ann McCracken. And for students of Irish history, they will know that Mary Ann was the sister of Henry Joy McCracken. So his travels throughout Ireland, each of his speeches was different. He was very sensitive to the local situations. Everywhere he went, people really embraced him and welcomed him. And it was just really successful. He definitely made a lasting impact. In Cork, the Women's Anti-Slavery Society, the Belfast Anti-Slavery Society, the women, they continued to support him after he'd gone back to America. So those friendships very much remained in place.
And one of the things that you mentioned, his love of music, Christine. I'd like for you to talk a little bit about that, and also about his use of photography to really advance his mission, and in that time of the 19th century, how important that was.
Yeah, so Frederick definitely loved music, and I was just rereading his narrative, and every time I read it, I find something different. But when he escaped, he got to New York, he sent for Anna Murray, the woman who'd helped him to escape. They got married. He wasn't born Frederick Douglass, he was born Frederick Bailey. At that point, he changed his name to Frederick Douglass. And he could have gone to Canada where he would have been safe, but he chose to remain in the United States. And he and Anna moved to New Bedford because there he knew he could get work on the docks. And also it was a Quaker community. He'd be relatively safe. But just rereading part of his narrative, and he said, they didn't have much worldly goods, they didn't have much luggage, but part of his luggage was 2 music books. So obviously he carried those music books everywhere he went. So that gives us some indication of the young Frederick loving music. We know when Frederick went, and I'm sure Nettie can speak more to this, but when Frederick went to Scotland, he was really feeling homesick, and he went out and bought himself a fiddle, taught himself to play. And whenever he felt depressed or homesick, he said he'd got out the fiddle and would play, and then he would, and this is his word, feel as lively as a cricket. So for him, music was very much therapy. Some of his meetings towards the latter end of being in Ireland, he would sing to the audiences, and they'd never heard music before in an abolitionist movement. So again, very important. And then I'm just going to say one thing and hand over to Nettie, because Nettie mentioned her grandfather, Joseph, and Frederick and Joseph had a very special relationship because of music. So I think Nettie should talk about this.
Oh, thank you. Well, the thing that I so amazes me, Christine was correct. In Scotland, he had become a little depressed. He'd been away from home, missed his family, and he went for a walk. And he passed a music store and he saw a violin in the window. He went in and purchased the violin, went back to his hotel room, and stayed there in his room for 3 days. And when he came out, he could play the violin. He taught himself to play the violin in 3 days. And his favorite pastime was to have my grandfather Joseph play for him. He gave my grandfather his first violin lessons, and my grandfather ultimately, I believe, graduated from Boston Conservatory of Music and became a concert violinist, was the first African-American to play at the White House under several presidents. But Frederick Douglass, and you can see his pictures all over the internet. Whenever you see Frederick Douglass with a young, slender man, he's either standing with his violin or without his violin. But that was Frederick Douglass's downtown, just sitting there and listening to Joseph play the violin. And I would hear, my grandmother would share that story with me too. Like I said, unfortunately, my grandfather died before I was born, but fortunately for me, he shared an awful lot of stories with my grandmother about his relationship with Frederick Douglass. So that was a very, very special time. And I've had the honor and the privilege of playing on Frederick Douglass's violin when I was growing up. Of course, I didn't understand the significance of it, but my grandmother, interestingly, kept the violins under her bed. She kept her fur coat locked up down the hall under lock and key, but the violin stayed in the bedroom. And I was able to play on them when I was a little girl.
And one of those violins is still at Cedar Hill in Washington, D.C., isn't it, Nettie?
It is. The one that's at Cedar Hill in the parlor is a replica of a Stradivarius. Now, my grandmother told me that the violin that I was playing on as a little girl was a Stradivarius. Although when you read the historians, I've not ever read anybody write about the Stradivarius, but she told me, she showed it to me, and she put it on loan to the Frederick Douglass home before it became part of the Park Service. And unfortunately, the home was broken into, and one of the things that was stolen was the violin. So I don't know what happened to it, but I remember playing on it.
And, turning back to the subject of photography, Frederick Douglass was perhaps the most photographed person of the 19th century. And it was important to him to present a certain image in photographs. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, if you notice in his pictures, and it's true, the book came out and it did say that he was proclaimed to be the most photographed. And even another edition's come out and they've added some more pictures to it. But he was very, very conscious of his physical appearance. He said that he never wanted to appear to be a happy slave. So looking into the camera, we say today that he would probably have more followers on Twitter and selfie. He, the inventor of the selfie, but it was a very intent on his look, the clothes that he wore, how he did his hair. And I even think my son mentions that you notice that his hair, the way he wore it, changed as he traveled about the world. I think he came back, was it from Ireland or Scotland, with a ponytail, but very conscious. And it was to project a positive image of a Black man.
Mm-hmm. And Frederick also became very active in the women's suffrage movement and women's rights. Tell us a little bit about what you think Frederick would think about Kamala Harris now becoming Vice President of the United States.
He would, I'm sure the first thing he'd say, it's about time, but congratulations. I mean, yes, it's awesome how far we've come. And also, he has something in common with Vice President Harris in that, unbeknownst to him, he was a vice president on the ticket with Victoria Woolhall, and it was 1872, and she ran for president, and she put him on her ticket, but neglected to tell him that she had done that. So I like to say, yes, Frederick Douglass and Kamala Harris. He was the first Black vice president nominee. She is the first vice president of the United States.
Can I just add to that? Not only was he nominated to be vice president in 1848 and again in 1888, he actually received one nomination to be
for president,
to run for president. Yeah, incredible.
Yes.
So Frederick had an affinity with Ireland throughout his life. Did he ever return after his transformative visit in 1845?
Yeah, good. I take that. Frederick, as an older man, he decided. Nettie might talk about this, but Frederick's first wife Anna died in 1882, and 2 years later, Frederick married a young white woman, which was incredibly controversial, even amongst family members, Helen Pitts, but it seems to have been a very happy union. And in 1886, he decided he wanted to return to Europe, not just to Ireland, to Europe, and to spend a year. but to go under very different circumstances. Now he could travel first class, he had a passport, he was a citizen, and not only did he want to go to Europe, he wanted to go to Egypt. He was fascinated by African culture. So he and Helen came to Europe. Unfortunately, towards the end of the trip, when Frederick was getting ready to go back to Ireland, Helen's mother became ill, so she returned to America. And so Frederick undertook the journey back. He came to Ireland 1887, and he said he wanted to look on the faces of those who'd looked after him 40 years earlier. Unfortunately, the Webbs, the Hortons, the Allens, who'd given him such shelter and such support, were now dead. But he communicated with their children, and he stayed with their children in 1887. And he stayed in the same house he'd stayed in 1845. It was then Great Brunswick Street. We now know it in Dublin as Pearse Street. Sadly, the actual house has been demolished. And when he was there, his host was the young Alfred Webb, who'd been a child in the 1840s. And Alfred Webb was a great nationalist. They must have had conversations about Ireland's most recent struggle for independence. And when Frederick came back to America, he started to make speeches in favour of Irish independence. So again, that two-way learning was very apparent. But we just know, even in some Frederick's final speeches, he referenced Daniel O'Connell and he referenced Ireland. So he really never forgot his time, his 2 times in Ireland.
Mm-hmm. We have a couple of questions from our audience. Let's see, from Sandra. Was there a difference in Douglass's reception in England versus Ireland?
Okay. So he was in Scotland, and then from Scotland he went down to England. And again, England, it had 2 different parts of the abolition movement, some who supported William Lloyd Garrison and others who didn't. So there were divisions within it. But again, Frederick really skillfully negotiated these differences. So he was very welcome. He lectured in total away from home for 20 months. So he was in England for over a year. Again, he was incredibly homesick, and it was some English women abolitionists who decided to take the step, the legal process of purchasing his freedom. So women really were heroes to Frederick, and vice versa. So in April 1847, Frederick was able to return home. So he was very welcomed in England. Again, I think part of the charm, the skill, he was so articulate and so sincere. And we know in his personal life, when he wasn't lecturing, he was incredibly charming.
Mm-hmm. We have another question here, and this one I'm going to pose to Nettie. To what degree, and this is from Simon, to what degree is Frederick's narrative taught in schools in the US today? And do you feel that abolitionism is sufficiently well taught in the US?
Interesting question. The first part about the narrative, I am thinking back. When I went to public school in Los Angeles, I never studied the narrative in school. And I'm not even sure my children did when they went to school. But it's being taught more today than it was, I would say, back when I was in school and when my kids were in school. And I would like to think one of the reasons is, because I just happen to have one right here, is because of our narrative. This is actually Frederick Douglass's narrative, but what we did, the Frederick Douglass Family Initiatives, for his 200th birthday, we reprinted the narrative as is, of course, didn't change anything he wrote, and then made a special edition with Brian Stevenson wrote the foreword, and there's some family pictures in here. And our goal, the program is called 1 Million Abolitionist Project. And our goal, no matter how long it takes, is to get 1 million copies of this book free to students across the country. And that is one of my main projects now that I'm retired. So to answer the question, it is being taught more today than it was back then, I'm happy to say. While I'm doing this, let me just mention this cover. This is a very traditional photo, you would think, of Frederick Douglass, but this is actually a drawing that my grandfather Joseph did of his grandfather. It's a huge drawing, and my son asked if we could use it to put it on the book. So I'm so honored to have my grandfather's painting or drawing of his grandfather on hopefully 1 million copies.
Oh, that's very nice. Thank you for sharing that, Nettie.
Thank you for the question. Thank you.
Yeah, I have just a question about a couple of Frederick's most famous speeches, and actually they were in the United States. One is the speech where he said, where he talked about what the 4th of July meant to a slave or didn't mean to a slave. And the other one was the speech that he gave at the unveiling of the Emancipation Memorial. Could you just touch on, either one of you, touch on those two speeches very briefly for us?
Let the historian do that one, please.
Oh my goodness. So I'm more familiar with his Irish speeches. I know the one 4th of July is sometimes seen as his greatest speech. I think it was made 1853, 1854, and it was actually women again. It was the Rochester Ladies Anti-Slavery Society. He spoke to them, and this was his speech, and it just, again, incredibly powerful. So people do like that speech. His speech at the unveiling of the Lincoln Memorial, which has been quite controversial this year when statues have come to the fore in public consciousness. And he generally approved of it, but he didn't like the fact that the Black man in it was supplicating, and he felt that that was not totally appropriate. And he spoke about, one day we will not be in this position of supplicating. So he was very aware of the stereotypes that even made their way into statues. So, but my favorite speech, if I can say, is one that Frederick made in 1893. As I said, he'd been appointed minister to Haiti, being the first Black republic in the world, and it had been shunned by everybody. And from being prosperous, it went to becoming, as today, incredibly poor. So Frederick spent a year there as the Consul General, came back, and in Chicago, he made a speech in defense of Haiti. And Haiti, where he references Daniel O'Connell and the history of Haiti to the history of Ireland, is really his finest speech. So that would be my personal favorite in terms of his speeches. But again, even the fact we can choose, it just shows how skilled he was as an orator and how his words still resonate today.
Mm-hmm. Let me ask a question of Nettie about his career, publishing his newspapers. And, he started publishing the North Star in Rochester, and you're actually taking the Frederick Douglass Family Initiatives organization back to Rochester soon. So tell us a little bit about his time in Rochester and the publication of the North Star.
Well, he spent about 25 years of his life was spent in Rochester, and a couple of his children were born in Rochester. My great-grandfather was born in New Bedford, but Rochester, and he's buried in Rochester. And so Rochester obviously was very, very important to him. And the publishing of the North Star is just amazing to me that a Black man back in that day was able to publish a newspaper, a very, very well respected newspaper. I unfortunately, I thought my grandmother had a copy of it. When I went through her things, I couldn't find it. So other than just knowing that he published it, I really don't know that much more about it, unfortunately. But I know it was very important to him. And the reason that we officially moved to Rochester, we were headquartered in Atlanta, because I'm here and this is where we started the organization. But we moved in 2019 to Rochester. And it's because of his love for the city. That's why we are now officially headquartered in Rochester, New York.
Mm-hmm. And you're continuing Frederick's legacy through the Frederick Douglass Family Initiatives.
We are.
What you're doing with that organization.
Yes, well, when we initially founded the organization in 2007, it was myself, my son, and my son's a dear friend. They both had Robert Benz as our executive vice president. Kenny's our president. They both had very, very lucrative marketing businesses. And I had been asked for an awful long time, especially when I moved to Atlanta, you know, what was I going to do? I needed to do something. And I said, I understand that I do, but my mother and I used to have these conversations when I was younger as to, first of all, why me? And she tried to explain why God chose me. And I would say to her, well, what does he want me to do with this? Because no one can be a Frederick Douglass. I'm not a man, and no one can be a Booker T. Washington. And she would say to me, my nickname is Honey, and she would say, honey, God will let you know when the time is right. You just have to be open to hear what he has to say. So I moved here, long story short. It came to be in 2007 when we founded the initiatives. And it was to honor the legacy, of course, of my great-great-grandfather and to magnify his work. But we started out by going to schools with our human trafficking prevention education. And we were the only organization at that time that could get into schools with that subject matter, because we could go in and talk about the history of Frederick Douglass and Booker T. Washington and what they did during their lives and bring it forward, which was today modern day slavery. And we asked ourselves, you know, what would Frederick Douglass do if he were here? And often I'm asked, what would Frederick Douglass say? And I would say I would never pretend to speak for Frederick Douglass, but I really felt in my heart that if he were here, he would be doing what we're doing now, because when he died, he thought slavery had ended. And it turned out, you know, modern day slavery, human trafficking. So we became the leading public charity in addressing this issue through strategies of prevention. And we do believe that that's what he would be doing if he were here today.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I have one last question for Christine, and that is, Christine, what is Frederick Douglass's enduring legacy in Ireland today?
Yeah, I think his legacy is that anything is possible. And if you look at his own life story, his incredible life story, and he writes about being a self-made man, that we are in charge of our destiny, and that, you know, just as Nettie said, we need to listen and we need to make change happen. And I think the other thing, and the words he used in Dublin, agitate, agitate, agitate. He wrote later on that power concedes nothing without a demand. And I think we know, those who've lived in the last 4 years in America, that, you know, democracy can be fragile. And if we want to bring about change, we have to be agents of that change. And, you know, Frederick, one man can make a difference. We all can make a difference. So I think that's really part of his legacy. And Ireland, and maybe it would have happened anyway, but we know, you know, the transformation that gave him that platform to build on really took place when he was in Ireland.
Thank you. Thank you. I think that's, you know, that brings us to the end of our program. That's a wonderful thought to end on. I'd like to thank you, Christine, and thank you, Nettie, for a very inspiring and insightful conversation today. Thanks again to Simon O'Connor and MoLI for your partnership in hosting the exhibition and this program for us, and all of your commitment to make it happen. Thanks to Ciarán Madden and the Department of Foreign Affairs for your support. And last but not least, I'd like to thank all of the people in our audience for joining us today for this program. And I invite all of you to follow the African American Irish Diaspora Network on Facebook and to connect with us on our website, aaidnet.org. That's aaidnet.org. And there's one final programming note I'd like to add, and that is to invite all of you to join the continuing celebration of Frederick Douglass during Frederick Douglass Week, February 8th through the 14th, where there will be a full schedule of very interesting and informative sessions. And for more information on that, go to the website douglasincork.com. That's douglasincork.com. Thank you very much, and good evening to everyone.
Thank you.
Morning.
Thank you. Thanks.